Shalom Torah Club members, this is D. Thomas Lancaster. Our Parsha today begins with the words, "The Lord said to Avram, Lech Lecha," which means, "Go forth." In a sense, this is where the story of the book of Genesis really gets going. Everything up until this point, Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, Enoch and Noah, the flood and Babel, has all been background information, quickly narrated, sort of a prelude to take you into the main story, which is the story of one man's family, the family of Abraham. For that matter, the entirety of the rest of the Bible is about that story, the story of Abraham's family, his children, his seed, and how these promises that God made to Abraham and to his son Isaac and to his son Jacob are being fulfilled. Abraham is the first forefather of the Jewish people, that is the nation of Israel. And as the apostles explain, Abraham is the ancestor of the promised singular seed, the Messiah, through whom all families of the earth will be blessed. Therefore, according to Paul, Abraham is reckoned the father of all who believe on the promised seed of Abraham, the Messiah. And for that reason, according to Paul, he is the father of our faith. And we may say and pray, Avraham Avinu, Abraham our father, because he is the father of both the Jewish people and the God-fearing Gentile disciples of Messiah. As Paul says, he is the father of all who believe without being circumcised, so that righteousness would be counted to them as well, and to make him the father of the circumcised, who are not merely circumcised, but who also walk in the footsteps of the faith that our father Abraham had before he was circumcised. Now, from this passage, we learn that the critical thing in regard to our paternity is not whether or not we are physically descended from Abraham, because the Ishmaelites are also physically descended from Abraham, and so are the Edomites. Nor is the most important question one of being legally part of Abraham's household, as was our master. The critical thing, from Paul's perspective, is this question: are you walking in the footsteps of Abraham's faith? Or as our master says, if you were Abraham's sons, you would do the deeds of Abraham. Walking in footsteps. I have this memory when I was a young boy, say 9 years old or so, and there was snow on the ground, maybe 6 inches, and my brother took these really long strides, and I remember consciously trying to match his stride, to let each footstep fall into the print left by his boots, not because I couldn't cut through 6 inches of snow myself, but because I wanted to be him. I wanted to be like him. So I was literally trying to walk in his footsteps. What does it mean that Abraham is our father, father of our faith, father of all who believe? It reminds me of one of my favorite Hasidic stories. It happened one night that a heavy snow fell in the shtetl. The next morning, the men got up before dawn to assemble for the morning prayers. They put on their fur coats and boots and trudged through the deep snow to the synagogue. But while they were still making their way, they heard what sounded like someone singing. In that dim pre-dawn light, they were surprised to see somebody dancing in the knee-high snow. They drew closer to observe. Someone was singing or mumbling and actually dancing in the snow, bundled up in a warm coat, but his teeth were chattering in the early morning chill. The men crept closer to try to see who this madman was, and as he stomped and danced in the snow, they could hear him saying to himself, almost singing to himself, "This is for the sake of a mitzvah." Utterly surprised, they suddenly realized this was none other than their own Rebbe. The Rebbe was probably a little embarrassed to be discovered dancing in the snow. He explained, "It's almost morning. Soon the school children will be rushing off to learn Torah. They are not very strong. Their families can't afford warm coats. Their shoes are worn and torn with holes. I thought that I, who have a warm fur coat, could blaze the way for them. I am making a path through the snow for them." Similarly, we can be likened to the school children in that story. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the fathers of our faith, can be likened to the man who stomped out a path through the snow. We are able to find our way because our fathers have blazed the trail of faith ahead of us. They weren't perfect men. Abraham twice called Sarah his sister, rather than rely on God for protection. He married Hagar, rather than wait for God's promise through Sarah. Isaac proved his fallibility by turning a blind eye to the wickedness of Esau, and Jacob is remembered for his cunning and trickery. But the consistent story of Scripture is not one of exceptional men as much as it is the story of an exceptional God. And biblical literature wouldn't be biblical literature if it didn't point out the humanness of its characters. In the Torah, we follow the lives of the forefathers as they stumble through the walk of faith. And the Torah tells us their stories so honestly that we are convinced we know these men personally. We learn that even the greatest men of faith were human. It's encouraging to us that they stumbled around and made some major mistakes, and we can take comfort in that. But at the same time, we must not forget the unique spiritual greatness of the fathers. Consider the greatness of the fathers. When is the last time God appeared to you? Yet he spoke to the fathers again and again, routinely even. Even the servants in their households, such as Hagar, received visitations from God. They were prophets, great prophets. He spoke to them. They heard his voice. God said to Abraham, "Go forth." Abraham went forth. He said, "Sacrifice for me." He sacrificed. He said to Isaac, "Stay," and Isaac stayed. He said to Jacob, "Go back," and he went back. Whatever he told them to do, they did. For example, when God told Abraham to sacrifice his son, not only did Abraham consent, but Isaac too consented to be sacrificed because God willed it. So precious are the fathers that God named himself after them. He is called the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. He's never called the God of Joseph or the God of Moses or the God of David. He's the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of our fathers. How beloved are our fathers! When Israel sinned by making the golden calf, God was angry enough to destroy them, but Moses stayed his hand by invoking the memory of the Lord's covenant with the fathers. Moses prayed, "Turn from your fierce anger. Relent and do not bring disaster on your people. Remember your servants Abraham, Isaac, and Israel." And God relented on their behalf. Paul explained it to us in Romans. He was explaining to the increasingly Gentile Roman congregations how it was that the Jewish people remained God's chosen people even though they had not accepted the gospel. And he said, "From the standpoint of the gospel, they are enemies for your sake. But from the standpoint of God's choice, they are beloved for the sake of the fathers. For the gifts and calling of God are irrevocable." That's Romans 11:28 and 29. Paul says, the Jewish people are loved on account of the fathers, for the sake of the fathers. How great are your fathers, O Israel! The daily prayer declares that for the sake of his devotion, his chesed to the fathers, he brings us a Redeemer, the ultimate Son of the ultimate Father. Traditional Jewish thought explains that Abraham went into Egypt to blaze the trail for his descendants. This is expressed in the Talmud by the oft-repeated phrase, "The deeds of the fathers are portents for the sons." Consider the parallels. Abraham went down to Egypt to escape famine. His wife was abducted by Pharaoh. God smote Pharaoh with plague to deliver Abraham and Sarah. Abraham left with great wealth, and so on. It's a story which the children of Abraham and the Israelites will live out again. They too will go down into Egypt to escape famine. They will be abducted, enslaved. God will strike Pharaoh and Egypt with plagues, and they will be delivered, carrying the wealth of Egypt. The story of Isaac's binding on the altar is a story the children of Isaac will live out again through the Messiah. The Messiah, like Isaac, an only begotten son of his father, born in a miraculous manner from his mother, offered up as a sacrifice in an act of covenant devotion. But before it happened, the fathers broke the way. When Abraham and Isaac broke the way by carrying out that dreadful mitzvah on Mount Moriah, God said to Abraham, "Because you have done this thing, I will bless you, and all the families on the earth will bless themselves by your seed," your descendant. In later years, Israel would struggle with the Philistines, but not before their father Isaac had contended with them. In later years, the children of Israel would struggle with the Edomites, but not before Jacob had struggled with Esau first. In later years, the Israelites would go into exile into the lands of Mesopotamia, but not before their father Jacob went there first. God would bring the Israelites back to their land, but not before he brought Jacob back first. So the fathers prepared the way. They blazed the trails that the children follow. They blazed the trail to the promised land. They broke the trail in and out of Egypt. They broke the trail in and out of exile. They broke the trail of faith. As their spiritual descendants, we are capable of the things they accomplished because we are their spiritual sons and daughters. This can be explained by a comparison to human genetics. Children possess within them the potential of their parents. Every possible potential of a child is actually inherited from the mother and the father. Those potentials may lay hidden and latent, buried somewhere in the children through the mystery of the genetic transmission process, but they are still there. Genetically, we are not new individuals. We are reconfigurations of our fathers and mothers. According to the way human genetics work, you are your father and mother, genetically scrambled and reconfigured. Spiritually, it works much the same. Our spiritual potential is, in some measure, derived from our spiritual fathers. Because of this, the adventures and misadventures of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob serve to foreshadow the paths and courses their children will follow. The deeds of the fathers really are portents for the sons. So, as we progress through these patriarchal narratives, we will take note of many such portents. There's a story about some of the disciples of the famous Maggid, who was himself a disciple of the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of Hasidic Judaism. One night, 3 relatively unlearned disciples were staying awake to tend the stove. They were discussing the Torah. They didn't know that the Maggid was listening to their conversation. The one said, "I don't see why Abraham is so great. If God talked to me and told me something, do you think I wouldn't do it? If he told me to sacrifice my son, do you think I wouldn't? If God talks to you, you listen. And think of all the generations of Jewish parents who have given their sons over to martyrdom rather than deny God. Are they any less great than Abraham?" They passed much of the night musing over this question. When the Maggid retold the conversation he had overheard, he explained, "Actually, the greatness of Abraham, the thing that makes his willingness to sacrifice his son greater than all others, is that he was the first." Although later generations might look to the story of the binding of Isaac and use it as a pattern for obedience and trust in God, even for inspiration unto the ultimate sacrifice, the greatness of Abraham is that he had no such story to look back upon. Rather, Abraham had to break the path of faith himself. He had to break through so that subsequent generations might follow. So the greatness of the fathers is that they blazed the trail of faith, and we walk in their footsteps. There's a tremendous lesson to be learned here. It's not easy being the first in anything. It's not easy being the first in your family to become a believer, for example. It's not easy being the first in your congregation or your church to have a conviction of the Shabbat. It's not easy being the first to keep the calendar or to keep the biblical dietary laws. These sorts of things leave us feeling strange and awkward about our own faith sometimes. Nor was it easy for Abraham to be the only one in his family that wasn't an idolater. It wasn't easy for Abraham to leave everything he knew and strike off for an unknown land. It wasn't easy for him to trust this strange God who was promising blessings of a universal scope, but who was also demanding so much, even his own son. It wasn't easy being the father of the faith, being the first. And it's not easy being Isaac, facing the altar, the famine, and the Philistines. And it's not easy being Jacob, going into exile, estranged from your own family, and the hard labor under Laban, while holding fast to the covenant promises. But just as they did for us, we must do for future generations. We may never see the results of the seeds we plant as we labor in the kingdom, but we can be certain of this: we are not the last link in the chain. To do our job well, we need simply blaze a trail for future generations to follow. If we can do that much, then we have lived up to the heritage of our spiritual forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. By our efforts now, we can leave a legacy of godliness for future generations, just as the fathers left a legacy of godliness for us.